From 1946 to 1954, the Huks, a communist organization, waged an armed rebellion in the Philippines aimed at overthrowing the US-aligned government and turning the country into a communist state. The main causes of the rebellion were the unequal distribution of agrarian land and the socio-economic imbalance, two factors that trace their origins to the Spanish colonial period. In 1565, Spain began the colonization of the islands that now comprise the Philippines. As in their territories in the American continent, Spanish authorities set up encomiendas in much of Luzon and the Visayas, where the native population was forced to work as slave labor in vast tracts of agricultural lands called haciendas that Spain had granted to Spanish settlers. Many rural encomiendas were also held by the powerful Spanish Catholic orders, where friars turned their vast haciendas into small autonomous enclaves and strictly controlled all aspects of the native population. The natives' living and working conditions in the encomiendas were dire, leading to many local uprisings that forced Spain to end the system by the mid-1600s. Still, the estates were attained, and although the harshest aspects of the encomienda were abolished, the natives' conditions remained grim. Spanish rule lasted for over 3 centuries, and by the latter 1800s, a small native upper and middle class had emerged. Then in 1898, Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States. During the American period, the Spanish-era stratified society of a few rich and masses of poor was retained, with the Philippine upper and middle classes now occupying positions of authority previously held by the Spanish colonials. The vast friar estates were seized and sold, with these lands bought by wealthy Filipino landowners and not by the masses of landless tenants and peasants who worked these lands. U.S. authorities also worked to transfer government powers in a future independent Philippines to the wealthy and land-owning classes. Thus, the few land-owning wealthy Filipinos also gained political power, while landless Filipinos remained poor and disenfranchised. As of yet, the U.S. government had established the Philippine Commonwealth. Such was the situation following the victory in 1921 of the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War, which resulted in communism gaining many followers around the world, the concept of class struggle finding relevance in many socio-economically disproportionate capitalist countries, including among the poor in the Philippines. In 1924 and 1930 respectively, 2 Filipino communist organizations were formed, the National Peasants Union and the Communist Party of the Philippines, or PKP, whose objectives were to work for social and agrarian reforms. U.S. authorities banned these organizations and jailed their leaders. Then in the 1930s, with the rise of fascist regimes in Europe and Japan and their threat to world peace, democratic Western powers and socialist Soviet Union formed an alliance to confront fascism. Consequently, in the Philippines, local communist leaders were released and formed an alliance with U.S. authorities to confront Japanese expansionism. In December 1941, World War II broke out in the Asia-Pacific and Japan invaded and occupied the Philippines and all of Southeast Asia. As a result of the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, many local guerrilla militias formed across the archipelago. The PKP Communists organized one such guerrilla militia that operated in central Luzon, headquartered on Mount Arayat. Its armed wing was called the National Army Against the Japanese, with its militia and fighters soon simply called Huks. Huk operations were so effective that large areas of central Luzon and beyond came under their control. The Huks were soon able to form quasi-governments in their areas that by war's end, Huk-aligned local administrations controlled much of central Luzon. Since the Huks advocated communism, they were shunned by the other partisan groups who were all US-aligned. By 1944, hostility toward the Huks grew when eventual Japanese defeat in World War II became certain. In September 1945, World War II ended with Japan's defeat in the Asia-Pacific. U.S. forces returned to the Philippines and restored the Philippine Commonwealth government into power. The U.S. command also ordered the disarming of all guerrilla militias. This was ignored by the Huks, who were then forcibly disarmed by U.S. and Filipino forces at gunpoint, including through violence. Then, with the United States preparing to grant independence to the Philippines, PKP communists joined ranks with 2 leftist trade unions to form the Democratic Alliance, or DA, a communist political party to participate in electoral politics. In general elections held in 1946, the DA ran and won all 6 congressional seats in Central Luzon. However, in the elections, a staunch anti-communist whose campaign included eliminating the PKP communists won the presidential race. Subsequently, the winning DA legislators were barred from taking office. Then in August 1946, when a prominent communist leader was assassinated, the Huks returned to Mount Arayat to restart the rebellion, this time against the Philippine government. The Huks restored their wartime organization in Central Luzon, where their support remained strong. The Philippine military launched operations against the Huks, which not only failed to find the rebels but were moral defeats for the government, as the soldiers committed abuses on the rural population, seizing farmers' crops and terrorizing the villagers. In the post-World War II period, the Philippine military experienced many problems: reduced funding, corrupt officers, low morale, poor discipline, and underpaid, undersupplied soldiers. In April 1948, a new president took office, who was initially conciliatory to the Huks, with whom a ceasefire was signed. Soon, however, government-Huk relations deteriorated and further negotiations broke down. The Huks then restarted the rebellion, leading to the most intense phase of the war. By 1950, the rebels had grown considerably. Huk influence had expanded, and rebel offensives involved up to several hundred to a few thousand fighters. At the start of the Cold War in 1947, U.S. foreign policy was focused on Europe with containing the perceived threat of Soviet expansionism in the continent. But in October 1949, with the communist victory in China, and in June 1950, with the outbreak of the Korean War, for the U.S. government, the Cold War had descended on Asia. The United States became militarily involved in the Korean War and provided military assistance to France's anti-communist war in Indochina, as well as backing its other allies, Thailand, Taiwan, and the Philippines. In the context of the Cold War, the U.S. government provided military assistance to the Philippines because of the growing threat of a communist victory. The United States delivered substantial military equipment and weapons, which would prove vital in the outcome of the war. Philippine military doctrine with regards to the Huks was also overhauled. Competent officers were promoted and underperformers demoted. Commands were reshuffled, and military strategy was changed from defensive to offensive. Corruption was curbed, and soldiers were given higher pay and sufficient supplies, which raised morale and discipline. The large unwieldy formations used in anti-Huk operations were reduced to lean and mean battalion units that emphasized speed and agility. Army patrols that passed the same areas were replaced with specially trained scout ranger teams that launched intelligence missions deep in Huk territory for up to several weeks at a time. A Hearts and Minds campaign was implemented in rebel areas, with army teams providing medical, humanitarian, and food distribution programs, public works, and technical assistance initiatives, which gained the trust and confidence of the rural population. Soon, peasant support for the Huks diminished, and farmers refused to provide the rebels with food and provisions. The Huks responded with violent reprisals on the villagers, which only further undermined their cause. At their peak in 1950, the Huks made preparations to seize power using a concentrated attack of 65,000 fighters on the capital, Manila, backed by a general uprising of 2.5 million civilian supporters. The plan was foiled in October 1950 when government forces captured the PKP Secretariat, which came right after the arrest earlier of the PKP Politburo. By 1951, Huk areas had been reduced, with rebel leaders in Panay Island killed by government forces. Then in 1952, a series of army offensives captured rebel commands in Nueva Ecija and Zambales, while another operation in the Huk's headquarters in Mount Arayat dealt a devastating blow to the rebels, as this mountain stronghold was deemed impregnable to attack. In April 1953, another army offensive on Mount Arayat destroyed more rebel camps. In February to September 1954, government forces conducted a major air and ground assault on the remaining 2,000 rebels that forced the surrender of the Huk leadership, bringing the war to an end. Mopping up operations ended resistance of the remaining insurgents. Small rebel bands continued to operate until the 1960s, but posed no more serious threat. Subsequently, the PKP gave up the struggle and worked with the Philippine government to advance reforms for the rural population. In 1968, PKP Maoists broke ranks with the Soviet-aligned PKP leadership and formed a new organization, also called the Communist Party of the Philippines, or CCP. In 1969, the CCP formed a military wing, the New People's Army, or NPA, with the core of its cadres being ex-members of the now-defunct Huk Militia. In 1971, the CCP-NPA launched a rebellion aimed at overthrowing the government and setting up a communist state. Over the years, successive Philippine governments have failed to quell the rebellion, and the low-intensity conflict continues to the present day, making it the world's longest ongoing communist insurgency.